FBI estimates in the United States alone at any given time there are 25 to 50 active serial killers. Now, imagine across the world. Arthur Shawcross, also known as the Genesee River Killer, was responsible for the murders of 11 women in upstate New York from 1988 to 1990. This was not the first time that he killed. In 1972, he confessed to the sexual assault and murders of 2 children. Arthur Shawcross was born on June 6, 1945, in Kittery, Maine. The family relocated to Watertown, New York a few years later. From early on, Shawcross was socially challenged and spent much of his time alone. His withdrawn behavior earned him the nickname Oddie from his peers. He was never a good student, failing both behaviorally and academically during his short time at school. He would often miss classes, and when he was there, he was regularly misbehaved and had the reputation of being a bully and picking fights with other students. Shawcross dropped out of school after failing to pass the 9th grade. He was 16 years old. Over the next few years, his violent behavior intensified, and he was suspected of arson and burglary. He was placed on probation in 1963 for breaking the window of a store. In 1964, Shawcross married, and the next year he and his wife had a son. In November of 1965, he was put on probation on a charge of unlawful entry. His wife filed for divorce soon afterwards, stating that he was abusive. As part of the divorce, Shawcross gave up all paternal rights to his son and never saw the child again. In April 1967, Shawcross was drafted into the Army. Right after receiving his draft papers, he married for the second time. He was sent to Vietnam from October of '67 until September of '68 and was then stationed at Fort Sill in Lawton, Oklahoma. Shawcross later claimed that he killed 39 enemy soldiers during combat. Officials disputed it and attributed him with a combat kill of 0. After his release from the Army, he and his wife returned to Clayton, New York. She divorced him shortly afterwards, citing abuse and his propensity to being a pyromaniac as her reasons. Shawcross was sentenced to 5 years in prison for arson in 1969. He was released in October of '71 after serving just 22 months of his sentence. He returned to Watertown, and by the following April, he was married for the 3rd time and working for the Public Works Department. Like his previous marriages, the marriage was short and ended abruptly after he confessed to murdering 2 local children. Within 6 months of each other, 2 Watertown children went missing in September of 1972. The first child was 10-year-old Jack Blake. His body was found a year later out in the woods. He had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The second child was Karen Ann Hill, age 8, who was visiting Watertown with her mother for the Labor Day weekend. Her body was found under a bridge. According to autopsy reports, she had been raped and murdered, and dirt and leaves were found jammed down her throat. Police investigators arrested Shawcross in October 1972 after he was identified as the man who was with Hill on the bridge right before she disappeared. After working out a plea deal, Shawcross confessed to murdering Hill and Blake and agreed to divulge the location of Blake's body in exchange for a charge of manslaughter in the Hill case and no charges for murdering Blake. Since they had no solid evidence to convict him in the Blake case, prosecutors agreed, and he was found guilty and given a 25-year sentence. Shawcross was 27 years old, divorced for the third time, and would be locked away until the age of 52. But after serving just 14 and a half years, he was released from prison. Being out of prison was challenging for Arthur Shawcross. Once word would get out about his criminal past, he had to be relocated to 4 different cities because of community protests. A decision was made to seal his records from public view, and he was moved one final time. In June 1987, Shawcross and his new girlfriend, Rose Marie Wally, were relocated to Rochester, New York. This time, there were no protests because Shawcross' parole officer failed to report to local police department that a child rapist and murderer had just moved into town. Life for Shawcross and Rose became routine. They got married, and Shawcross worked various low-skilled jobs. It did not take long for him to become bored with his new menial life. So in March of 1988, Shawcross began cheating on his wife with a new girlfriend. He was also spending a lot of time with prostitutes. Unfortunately, over the next 2 years, many of the prostitutes that he got to know would end up dead. Dorothy, or Dotsy, as her friends called her, Blackburn, was 27, cocaine addict, and a prostitute who often worked on Lyle Avenue, a section in Rochester that was known for being seedy. On March 18, 1989, Blackbird was reported missing by her sister. 6 days later, her body was pulled from the Genesee River Gorge. An autopsy revealed that she had suffered severe wounds from a blunt object. There were also human bite marks found all over her vagina. The cause of death was strangulation. Blackburn's lifestyle opened a broad range of possible suspects for case detectives to investigate, but with too few clues, the case eventually went cold. In September, 6 months after Blackburn's body was found, the bones from another missing Lyle Avenue prostitute, Anna Marie Stephen, was found by a man who was collecting bottles to sell for cash. Investigators were unable to identify victims whose bones were found, so they hired an anthropologist to reconstruct the victim's facial features based on a skull that was found on the scene. Stephen's father saw the facial recreation and identified the victim as his daughter, Anna Marie. Dental records provided additional confirmation. The decapitated and decomposing remains of a homeless woman, 60-year-old Dorothy Keller, was found on October 21, 1989, in the Genesee River Gorge. She died from having her neck broken. Another Lyle Avenue prostitute, Patricia, or Patty, Ives, 25, was strangled to death and buried under a pile of debris on October 27, 1989. She had been missing for nearly a month. With the discovery of Patty Ives, investigators realized that it was a strong possibility that a serial killer was loose in Rochester. They had the bodies of 4 women, all who went missing and who were murdered within 7 months of each other. 3 had been murdered within a few weeks of each other, and 3 of the victims were prostitutes from Lyle Avenue, and all of the victims had bite marks and had been strangled to death. I'd say we have a signature. Investigators went from looking for individual killers to looking for a serial killer, and the window of time between his kills was getting shorter as he was escalating. The press also grew interested in the murders and dubbed the killer as the Genesee River Killer and the Rochester Strangler. On October 23rd, June Stott, 30, was reported missing by her boyfriend. Stott was mentally ill and would occasionally vanish without telling anyone. This, along with the fact that she was not a prostitute or drug user, kept her disappearance separated from the serial killer investigation. Marie Welch, age 22, also a Lyle Avenue prostitute, was reported missing November 5, 1989. Frances, or Franny Brown, age 22, was last seen alive, leaving Lyle Avenue on November 11th, with a client known by some of the prostitutes as Mike or Mitch. Her body, nude except for her boots, was discovered 3 days later dumped in the Genesee River Gorge. She had been beaten and strangled to death. Kimberly Logan, 30, yet another Lyle Avenue prostitute, was found dead on November 15, 1989. She had been brutally kicked and beaten, and dirt and leaves were crammed down her throat, much like Shawcross did to 8-year-old Karen Ann Hill. This was one piece of evidence could have led the authorities right to Shawcross, had they known he was living in Rochester. At the beginning of November, Joanne Van Nostrand told police about a client named Mitch, who paid her to play dead, and then he would try to strangle her, which she did not allow. Van Nostrand was a seasoned prostitute who had entertained men with all kinds of particularities, but this Mitch, managed to give her the creeps. This was the first real lead the investigators received, and needed. It was the second time that the man with the same physical description, named Mike or Mitch, had been mentioned in reference to the murders. Interviews with many of the Lyle prostitutes indicated that he was a regular and that he had a reputation of being violent. Frustrated with the rising body count of murders targeting prostitutes, a local police captain decided to call in the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, contacting Special Agent Greg McCreary and describing the rash of murders to him. He and New York State Trooper Lieutenant Ed Grant, a graduate of the FBI training program in criminal investigative analysis, both promptly decided to aid Rochester authorities in solving the murders. However, on November 27th, before the two arrived, the body of a prostitute named Elizabeth Gibson was found, being the only victim to not be killed in Monroe County, instead being found in Wayne County, but nevertheless, she was connected to the other murders by a witness who saw her with a man who called himself Mitch. Following this, 3 more prostitutes went missing: June Cicero, Darlene Trippi, and Felicia Stevens. On the morning of New Year's Eve, Felicia Steffens' belongings were discovered by a trooper patrolling a rural area. Authorities began to search for her body in the area by air, but they were complicated by the current snowy weather. 2 days later, a body was found under a bridge, but it was later identified as June Cicero, who was, quite ironically, aware of the killer and took measures to avoid customers that she didn't know. On that same bridge, they spotted Shawcross urinating there, then driving off in his Chevrolet Celebrity before police could reach him. A unit followed him to a nursing home in Spencer Court, where they confronted Shawcross, who identified himself and then revealed responsibility for the Watertown child murders. Taken to a police station under suspicion, Arthur Shawcross insisted that it was merely a coincidence that he was urinating near Cicero's crime scene, and repeatedly bragged about his accomplishments as a soldier in the Vietnam War. Investigators were unsure if they could pin a killer pedophile on the prostitute killings, since pedophiles never change their victim types so drastically. However, suspicion on Shawcross grew further when several prostitutes, including a would-be victim, positively identified him as Mitch. Subsequently, investigators uncovered his background and were shocked to learn the circumstances behind his release and his movement through multiple communities was later covered up. The following morning, Felicia Stevens' body was discovered by a deer hunter, located near the spot where June Cicero's body was found. Knowing for sure that Shawcross was the killer, police began to pressure him during interviews. Although he maintained his cool, dismissing the evidence against him as coincidence, until an officer suspected Neil of being involved in the killings as well, to which Shawcross denied it. He then confessed to being the killer and stated that he specifically killed Elizabeth Gibson, the only victim to be killed outside that county, because she was trying to steal his wallet, and while defending himself, he projected his mother onto her and subsequently strangled her to death. He also assisted police in finding the bodies of Marie Welch and Darlene Trippi, personally leading them to the disposal sites. Eventually, Arthur Shawcross was tied to all but one of the Rochester killings, Kimberly Logan, who had leaves stuffed down her throat in the same manner as Karen Hill. the second victim of the Watertown child murders, but Shawcross denied ever killing her. Although some investigators believe that he was responsible for her death, in the end, Shawcross had a court stenographer write down a 79-page long formal confession. In November of 1990, Arthur Shawcross was tried by the Monroe County First Assistant District Attorney Charles J. Siragusa for the 10 murders that occurred in Monroe County. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, with testimony from a psychiatrist that he suffered from a dissociative personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and possible child abuse. The former stemmed from his service in the Vietnam War. His many outlandish tales of committing gruesome crimes, including cannibalism, often while he was alone in the jungle, and the horror stories he told of other people about the war when he returned home from his tour of duty. Profiler Robert Ressler reviewed the PTSD claim on behalf of the prosecution before the trial, writing that his allegations about the Vietnam War were untrue, while a psychiatrist also stated that he had antisocial personality disorder. In the end, after 13 weeks, Shawcross was found guilty of 10 counts of second-degree murder and was sentenced to a total of 250 years to life in prison for the Monroe County killings. A few months later, Shawcross was taken to Wayne County to be tried for Elizabeth Gibson's murder. He pleaded guilty to the murder and was later given a life sentence. Afterward, Shawcross was held at the Sullivan Correctional Facility located in Fallsburg, New York, where he would remain until his death. In 2003, he was interviewed by British reporter Captain English for a documentary on cannibalism. During the interview, Shawcross bragged about slicing out and eating the genitals of 3 of his victims, but refused to discuss any earlier allegations that he made of eating the genitals of his first victim, Jack Blake. In 2006, he was interviewed by Columbia University forensic psychiatrist Dr. Michael Stone for the Discovery Channel series Most Evil, which Stone presented. In the interview, Arthur alleged that he was sexually abused by his mother when he was a child, and also admitted to sexually abusing his younger sister. He also claimed that he murdered the Rochester prostitutes in revenge for supposedly having sex with an HIV-positive prostitute, and to eat the body parts in order to speed up the process of death, out of the assumption that he was infected. Stone agreed with the jury's conclusion of his allegations and did not believe that Shawcross was out of control during the prostitute murders and that he didn't have any outlandish motivations for doing so. In the afternoon of November 10, 2008, Arthur Shawcross complained of a pain in his leg. As a result, he was taken to Albany Medical Center, where he suddenly went into cardiac arrest. At 9:50 p.m., he died, age 63. Afterward, he was cremated at a private crematorium.